Those that have been with us earlier this morning, welcome to our third presentation of the day. And if this is your first one, welcome. We're glad to have you with us. And basically in the chat box on YouTube is where you can enter in any questions, and I will relay those to Kevin as we go. And beyond that, I'm going to turn it over to Betty Jean Jordan, our Executive Director for GSPE.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome everybody, especially, as he said, those of you that have not been on the previous two sessions. So thank you for being here, and thank you so much to Kevin for being with us from the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. I got to see his session actually a couple of months ago with Georgia Adopt a Stream, so this one I know firsthand is a good one. Want to encourage you all, if you're not already a member of GSPE, to join us. Go to our parent organization, nspe.org, and there's a Join Now button at the top right-hand corner. You can easily join us. This will be a 1-hour session, and we might possibly go a few minutes late, but we have plenty of time, and we'll have an hour break after this so everybody can eat lunch before we pick up again this afternoon. Remind everybody to renew your PE license before December 31st. Let's see, I will be sending out PDH Day certificates via email early next week. And also these sessions will be available at some point in the future online if somebody signed up, for example, and didn't see it before, or if you want to go back and rewatch it. And one last thing we've discovered on our previous sessions, if you are not logged into YouTube, if you don't have an account, for example, and you want to ask a question, you can just send me an email and I will post it for you. So with that, let me turn it over to Kevin. Thank you so much.
Hey, yeah, thank you, Betty Jean, and thank you, Steve. I'm happy to be here with you all today. I was just telling Steve and Betty Jean that I know your situation. I just participated in 3 hours of continuing legal education credits yesterday and have 3 more this afternoon starting at 1. So I'll try to make this as interesting as possible. My hope is that you can see its relevancy to your work, particularly if if you're working in environmental hydraulic engineering, if you're working in any sort of commercial real estate and structural or other kind of mechanical engineering. You get involved in projects that may have impacts on the environment. You may be experts, consultants who work with attorneys like me. I'm sorry on behalf of attorneys that you might have to deal with us. I have a lot of experience working with the experts and engineers in my role as an attorney, and have always valued the expertise that you provide. Today, I'm going to talk to you about environmental legislation at the Georgia General Assembly, and there are some pieces of legislation here that do directly relate to professional engineers. And there are others that, may be more tangential, but this is just a presentation that gives you an overview of some of the legislative issues that are being brought to the Georgia General Assembly by citizens, by groups like mine, and introduced by legislators themselves. So my name is Kevin Jeselnik. I'm the general counsel for Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. And in that role, I serve as a registered lobbyist and advocate for Georgia waterways, the Chattahoochee specifically, at the General Assembly every year. I'll talk a little bit about Riverkeeper very quickly. We're a 501c3 nonprofit with more than 10,000 members across the Southeast and the country, really, but mostly here in Georgia. We have 3 offices in Atlanta, up on Lake Lanier, and down on West Point Lake along the river. We do a lot of work beyond our legislative work on the ground: water quality monitoring, enforcement, advocacy, education, research. We've been around for about 26 years. We're part of a broader Waterkeeper Alliance. We're an individual nonprofit, but we're part of this larger network of worldwide advocates. The Chattahoochee watershed, I'm sure many of you may be familiar with it, is a pretty vital watershed for Georgia because it provides the drinking water for more than 5 million Georgians, most of those centered on the metro Atlanta area. It's about 430 miles long, flowing down to Lake Seminole and meeting the Flint River to become the Apalachicola River and flowing into the Gulf of Mexico. our charter with Chattahoochee Riverkeeper is from its headwaters near Helen all the way to its ending in Lake Seminole. So we cover the river as it flows down the entire state of Georgia. Our legislative work is kind of a team effort that we partake in along with a lot of other individual groups. And together we comprise what's called the Georgia Water Coalition. So the Georgia Water Coalition is a loose network of nonprofits, lake ownership groups, faith-based groups, businesses that are all focused on protecting and caring for Georgia's surface waters and groundwaters. And so it's in that coalition that we do our legislative work. And excuse me, the legislative work that the coalition does is really interesting and fascinating work, and it's very hands-on, involved, in-depth work. We meet every week during the legislative session prior to the COVID-19 pandemic in person. We meet every Wednesday at a building across from the Capitol and strategize on how to advance Water Coalition priorities and address other environmental and water-related legislation that may be cropping up, and push back against what we call rollbacks, legislation that's introduced that we think will strip existing protections for the environment or otherwise weaken, the legal and regulatory structure in Georgia that protects our environment and waterways. No surprise, everyone's life has been utterly interrupted in 2020. The legislative session was no different. Typically, at the Georgia General Assembly, a legislative session runs from the, second Tuesday or second full week of January. It's usually around January 15th for 40 legislative days, and then adjourns. Typically, it adjourns in the last week of March or the first few days of April. The legislators like to be done in time to go down to Augusta for the Masters. So that's your typical schedules. You're going to be out of there by the first couple of days of April. Obviously, that was completely different this year. The legislative session was suspended on March 13th. They ended up resuming on June 11th and adjourning sine die, which is the resolution of the legislative session on June 26th. They essentially had to come back to fulfill their one constitutionally mandated obligation they have each year, which is to set on a fiscal budget every year by the end of June. So they are mandated to approve a budget, and I think that deadline is June 30th. So they had no choice really but to find a way to resume in June. And what we found is that resumption of the session in June didn't leave a lot of room for extraneous issues beyond the budget, but there was still some activity that occurred throughout there, with different legislation. And some of our diehard lobbyists, not me, actually, continued to attend the committee meetings and the floor sessions at the Capitol during that time in June. So we applaud all the legislators and lobbyists that had to kind of put themselves at risk to come back and finish this job.
Hey, Kevin. We do have a quick question here. M.R. Chasman is asking if your meetings are open to the general public.
So the Georgia Water Coalition legislative team meetings aren't open to the general public. We are a member-based group. We have about 277 groups, organizations, businesses that are members of the Georgia Water Coalition. Our website is gawater.org, gawater.org. This is not a fee-based, again, it's a very loose network of groups. Anybody who's a member of the Georgia Water Coalition can join our legislative team. We have about 45 members of our legislative team. And the requirement really to be a member is to call in or attend half of those meetings roughly, and just be available to reach out to legislators and kind of, assist the Water Coalition legislative team in advancing its priorities. We adopt 2 to 3 priorities every year, that are supported by consensus by our entire member group, all of our members. And then the legislative team's job is really to carry forward those priorities that are adopted by the full membership, as well as kind of fight back, like I said, these rollbacks. We do have postings on our website on GA Water where we kind of put weekly updates together. And I put those together every week during the legislative session and send those out. So just during the session about what are the kind of important bills we're watching, how we're doing on progress on our priority legislation. But we can certainly have guests. If you're interested, you can reach out to me. I'd be happy to share my contact information. Again, it was on the first slide, but we don't generally just open up the meetings to the public, but we do want to be transparent and talk to the public about the issues we're working on. We work really fast because things change so quickly during the session. We talk very deeply at a very kind of granular level about our strategies. So it's tough for us to just open those meetings up. Broader issues that we're implicating all state agencies, but in our interest, the Department of Natural Resources and the Environmental Protection Division that works under the Department of Natural Resources were budget cuts that we are anticipating. The legislative session works in 2-year terms, so this was a 2019-2020 session. That means that any legislation introduced in 2019, even if it doesn't pass by the end of the 2019 session, March, April 2019, it can be brought back in 2020. And so again, now in 2021, 2022, we'll start over with a fresh batch of legislation, but it works in 2-year terms. So in 2019, Governor Kemp indicated that every agency was going to have to propose 4 to 6% budget cuts. But once the session was suspended, he started sending out indicators to agency heads and legislators that he was looking at more like 14% cuts. We were looking at decreased tax revenues coming in the early part of the year, and just kind of trying to read the tea leaves. And we were very concerned about the breadth of the cuts across the agencies. In the end, the cuts were approximately 10% for most agencies for the FY21 budget. So that's still a pretty substantial cut, especially for a cash-strapped, resource-strapped agency like DNR and the Environmental Protection Division that's been kind of being bled to death over the past decade with 2-3% cuts this year, 4% cuts this year. So, you'll see some legislation in a few minutes that we're looking for ways to help the agency. We're not just trying to stand on the sidelines and criticize and shout down the Environmental Protection Division, groups like Riverkeeper and Georgia Water Coalition. We're trying to find ways to give them the resources to protect the environment. So with all this, with the budget cuts, I think it's an interesting story because this was actually a banner year for Georgia's environment under the Gold Dome, at least in my experience over the past 7 to 10 years. Because of the budget, in spite of the budget cuts, the pandemic, we actually, at the Water Coalition and other organizations working to protect the Georgia environment, had a really good year with legislation, whether that means passing proactive legislation or fighting back some of the more potentially impactful rollbacks that we were worried about. So the first legislative issue I want to talk about is really the big win that the Georgia Water Coalition and many other people have been working towards for more than 14 years on the coalition's part, is what we call trust fund honesty. So what this addresses is designated fees for environmental programs and many other programs across state agencies and local governments as well. Trust funds are set up by the General Assembly, and they are created to receive and administer fees for very specific purposes. And again, the operative word here is fees. These are funded by fees that we all pay in various ways in our day-to-day lives, not by taxes that we pay. So these trust funds, it's really important that you understand that they're fee-based, not tax-based. Which was kind of the underlying conflict that we have been trying to right for a number of years. So over the decades, these trust funds are being funded by fees but there was no mechanism to require that the fees were actually sent to the trust funds and spent the way that the trust funds anticipated them being spent. So over the decades, well more than $200 million has been misappropriated from the solid waste trust fund and the hazardous waste trust fund, which are the two environmental trust funds that the Georgia Water Coalition's always been concerned about. Essentially, these fees are paid and the monies come in and are tracked, and then the General Assembly was not bound to send those fees to the two trust funds. So they would take portions of these sums of money and just reroute them throughout the general fund to fill gaps in the budget each year, which we found to be a misuse of funds. These are not taxes that can be appropriated as the legislature sees fit. These are fees that are being paid specifically to serve the purposes of these trust funds. So they should be sent directly to the trust funds. If the fees are too large and we have too much money, then you can reduce the fees, but you shouldn't be able to misappropriate the fees. And I'll try to, I guess, explain a little more. When you buy new tires for your car, you pay an extra $1. So if you buy a new set of 4 tires, you're paying $4 extra on that transaction that are fees paid into the solid waste trust fund for the purposes of eventually flowing that money down to local governments to address scrap tire dumps and other issues that we know come up as a result of kind of dumping and waste of scrap tires. So we've seen tens of millions of dollars that should be trickling down through the trust fund to local governments to address tire dumps being used to fill gaps in the general budget. Similarly, when you pay to send money to a landfill, or you pay your fees for the solid waste services you get through your local government, a portion of those fees are going to the solid waste trust fund to ostensibly help local governments address the impacts they may have from hosting a municipal solid waste landfill within their boundaries, whether that's having to do additional road maintenance on the roads that get heavy truck traffic around the landfill, or fugitive dust, or any sort of other issues that may arise just from the regular course of having a landfill within their jurisdiction. So these are important fees that are paid for a specific purpose, and the General Assembly was allowed to kind of move them around to fill gaps. And the reason this was happening is because the Georgia Constitution didn't allow the General Assembly to dedicate these fees to the trust funds. So the Georgia General Assembly literally lacked the authority to require that the fees go to the trust funds. So they could express that as a deeply felt intent, but they couldn't legally require that every penny paid in went to the trust fund. So that required an amendment to the Constitution. And in 2020, we finally did this. We passed what's called House Resolution 164. It is a resolution calling for a constitutional amendment, and it needed 2/3 majority vote by legislatures in the House and the Senate, and it received finally in 2020 overwhelming passage in the House and then in the Senate. There was one vote against it in the House, and that was by someone we call Representative No, who votes no on essentially every piece of legislation. And I think maybe 2 or 3 no votes in the Senate. It was overwhelmingly supported. So why was it held up for decades, or at least 14 years? It was held up in the Georgia Senate Appropriations Committee, and for the reason I just expressed, the Senate Appropriations Committee is the committee that sets our fiscal year budget each year. Has to wrangle and herd all the cats of all the different agencies and all the different legislatures and other, the administration's goals, and put forward a budget that all the legislators can approve every year and the governor can sign. And so various Senate appropriations chairmen over the years have really liked having, a couple dozen million dollars sitting around each year that they could, move about to fill gaps and satisfy pet projects from legislators or other people. So we had to overcome this one tiny pinch point over many years through citizen pressure and bipartisan support to finally get through that committee. And I'll say that the lieutenant governor, I'm blanking on his name right now, and I apologize, but our lieutenant governor supported this when he was in the House of Representatives and really helped push this through over the last 2 years, finally get us over the hump and out of the Senate committee and onto the actual Senate floor for a vote, where it was, again, overwhelmingly approved. And that was not the final step, which was that it be approved by Georgia voters on November 3rd. That has to be done to amend the Georgia Constitution. We needed 2/3 approval. We got 81.6 of all Georgia voters that voted on this, more than 3.85 million votes. So overwhelming approval for trust fund honesty. So again, a huge victory, I think, for transparency and honesty in government, and something we're all excited to see move forward now. This is kind of the impact it may have. I've mentioned the 10% budget cuts that we anticipate or that we know are coming. And so local governments and the state government's going to need funds to help protect the environment. And we think this is a new vehicle, a long existing vehicle, but a new kind of increase in funds to help fill some gaps. So, excuse the typo, we go back to the General Assembly in 2021 because we're not totally done. The General Assembly now has the authority to dedicate these fees, but they haven't dedicated them yet. Now they have to exercise that authority and actually pass legislation in 2021 that says, yes, every dollar paid for the purchase of new tires actually has to be transferred to the Solid Waste Trust Fund. And same for the tipping fees that we're paying in the landfills. That small amount of the tipping fee paid into landfills now needs to be sent to these trust funds for the purposes they're being collected for. So we're going to keep working on this issue in 2021, but we've crossed the major hurdle. And again, a lot of legislators have kind of worried about the state agencies or the local governments building up like war chests from these. And our answer to that is, we'll just reduce the fee. If $1 per tire is too much, make it 50 cents or 42 cents or 73 cents, whatever is appropriate to give the state agency the right amount of funds to address these issues. And one of the major issues that this map is a list of most of the hazardous waste sites in Georgia that are on the hazardous site inventory list. And so there are, well over 100, I think far more than 100. I haven't looked at the list. I'm probably way off. There are many, many hazardous waste sites identified by Georgia EPD on its inventory list that need to be remediated. And some of the fees that we're talking about are used to fill that hazardous waste trust fund to help the state agency, where there's no private actor willing to step up. And if it's not a CERCLA Superfund site where there's, potentially responsible parties and all that, rigmarole, the state agency and the local governments nearby need to step up and start remediating some of these sites. And so what we hope we see is the hazardous waste trust fund build up some reserves to start addressing some of these sites. There was an article just recently about some of the coastal hazardous sites that studies are showing are going to be impacted by rising sea levels and climate change. So we need to get the contaminated soils and groundwater addressed so that they're not inundated and certainly migrating off site even more than they may already be. We got this passed through the constitutional amendment phase. So we're really just gearing up for 2021. If anyone does have questions about this or wants to know how they can just be informed and potentially take action in these legislative issues, protectgeorgia.org is something you can check out, and you can sign up for our action alerts. We reach out during the legislative session to give Georgia citizens the opportunity to contact their legislators. If you take an action here, we can actually tailor it to your senator, your House rep, to the governor, to the lieutenant governor, whoever we need to reach. And we're certainly going to be working on that next step of dedicating these two trust fund fees in 2021. And Steve, I'm happy to take questions as they crop up, but if not, I'll just keep moving through the issues and then leave time.
Sure.
At the
Yeah,
end.
I haven't seen anything else that wasn't already answered. There was actually one, but you answered it like right after they asked. So,
well, you just let me know. You can interrupt anytime you want.
will do. Thanks.
What I'm kind of doing here is going through our two top priorities of the Georgia Water Coalition before I talk about some other environmental legislation. So I'm going to kind of try to indoctrinate you all first in the Water Coalition's issues, and then we'll talk about some general environmental legislation and some professional engineering related legislation that came up over the past 2 years. The second of the Georgia Water Coalition's legislative priorities over the past really 6 years has been addressing coal ash. So this is the Water Coalition's priority policy position on this. Coal ash, coal combustion residuals is the spent waste left over from burning coal for energy, power generation. This is, a very topical, relevant, and pressing concern in Georgia and across the country. In 2015, the federal government declined to regulate coal ash as a hazardous waste. It's just a solid waste. And so it set, at that time of making that determination, some federal regulations about how utilities and coal ash generators can handle this waste stream, but obviously left a lot of discretion because it doesn't fall under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. It's not a hazardous waste, according to the federal government. So there's a lot of new regulations at the state and at the federal level about how to address this, but we think they fall very short because of the kind of discretion the waste generators get now because it's treated as a solid waste. The Water Coalition believes that all coal ash should be disposed of in lined and capped facilities, permitted landfills, whether they're municipal solid waste landfills or private landfills on a Georgia Power property or the utilities property. We think there needs to be more robust groundwater monitoring around the coal ash impoundments. And we want to make sure that, the coal ash isn't draining by surface water or through groundwater into nearby waterways. What we know now, based on Georgia Power's own reporting in Georgia, is that let me step back. Georgia Power stores about 80 million tons of coal ash in various pits at its 11 of its power plants across the state of Georgia. Approximately 30 million tons of that, Georgia Power is committing to excavate and remove to lined storage, so into private landfills or municipal solid waste landfills that have liners under them. And leachate collection systems, and they're working under permits issued by the state EPD land protection branch. About 50 million tons is proposed to be what's called capped in place. And all that really means is they're going to leave it in these unlined pits that it's been sitting in for as much as 60, 70 years in some instances, and put a clay or synthetic layer on top to prevent new rainwater, stormwater from inundating these unlined pits, but does nothing for the groundwater that's already there. They're pumping out the decades of accumulated stormwater and wastewater that's in these pits. But what we found is that many of these pits are sitting inundated in groundwater. Along the Chattahoochee, along the Coosa, and along the Ocmulgee, Oconee as it flows into the Altamaha River. So it's a huge concern for the Water Coalition and the various riverkeeper groups, Chattahoochee, Coosa, Altamaha Riverkeeper, where in the Chattahoochee, 30 million of those 50 million tons are going to be left in unlined pits along our river in Cobb County, and then down in Coweta and Heard County, Troup County, farther in the middle Georgia area where the river flows through Plant Wansley and Plant Yates in the Chattahoochee. So we've been trying to advance legislation that would call for excavation of this waste into lined landfills, because Georgia Power does do groundwater monitoring on its own properties around these and has shown elevated levels of heavy metals. Heavy metals are the toxic constituents of coal ash waste that we are very concerned about seeing in groundwater or drinking water. So we know that it has shown up in monitoring wells on Georgia Power property. We know that some of these pits are going to be sitting inundated in groundwater for perpetuity. And all of these pits are located right along these rivers. So we don't like the idea of them being left inundated in groundwater along our major waterways. In Juliet, Georgia, testing of people's private waterways around Lake Juliet, which is near Plant Scherer, has shown elevated levels of toxic heavy metals. Georgia Power has purchased a lot of property around their coal ash impoundments around Lake Juliet, but is not required to do any testing of private properties that it doesn't own. And so it hasn't really reported any data that shows off-site, off of the Georgia Power properties, contamination of groundwater. And so there's no trigger requiring the utility to take steps to remediate this, excavate this, because they're not reporting any data, because they're not doing much testing off-site or any that we know of, to really determine if there has been off-site migration of this. Although some private parties like the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper and other third parties are doing some testing in Monroe County around Lake Juliet. This raising a lot of concerns. This is a lot of detail here, but it just shows where coal ash is stored right now. The black and white items are the actual power plants where coal ash is stored. The purple magenta are current landfills that asked the state EPD for permission to receive coal ash waste. And it's not that we necessarily oppose landfills receiving coal ash waste. We just think, and most of these landfills have done so, need to prove that it's being stored in safe ways and lined cells of the landfill that are above the aquifer and well away from flood zones, because we don't want to see portions of the landfill that are containing groundwater, very close to the aquifer, even if they are lined, or in an area that could be inundated by water. This is just some of the data already discussed. So we did have our first piece of legislation in 2020 passed that addresses coal ash waste and storage, that we think is actually, it's not what we've wanted to see. We've introduced a lot of legislation to kind of push that excavation into line containment. This one is addressing another issue, which is we were worried about the importation of out-of-state coal ash into the state of Georgia, because a lot of other states in the Southeast are also trying to address issues with this legacy waste. We know that South Carolina has been importing coal ash into Georgia for a number of years into the R&B landfill in Banks County, Georgia, and Homer, Georgia. And so we were looking for ways to kind of disincentivize the importation of out-of-state ash. We have enough. We have 80 million tons that we have to deal with in Georgia. We don't really need to be the cheapest place in the country or in the region to store this for other states and other utilities. So a couple years ago, the tipping fee was increased in Georgia. There's a portion of the tipping fee that is paid to the local government, and that surcharge has always been just $1 out of the $30, $40 per ton that might be coming into a landfill operator. And the state of Georgia sought to increase that just to get in lockstep with other states. But when they increased this local government host fee to $2.50 from $1, they actually carved out an exception for coal ash. Maybe because Georgia Power was going to be moving so much coal ash around over the next couple of years, but the unintended effect, or maybe intended effect, of carving out and leaving the price of coal ash, into landfills at a cheaper cost, was, we think, to incentivize out-of-state ash. And we saw a lot of ash coming in, particularly to a landfill in Southeast Georgia from a Florida terminal. So it could be out of country ash, out of state ash being brought into Georgia and Southeast Georgia, as well as that South Carolina coal ash coming into Banks County. So what we did was just kind of eliminate that loophole and make coal ash cost at least as much as regular household waste when it's being sent into a landfill. Do you have a question, Steve?
Yes, we do.
Sure.
So M.R. Chasman is asking, are there any cost estimates to transfer all coal ash to lined landfills?
I should have those numbers. That's a good question. So Georgia Power has been going to the Public Service Commission, who sets their rates and reviews their integrated resource plan, to discuss the work they are doing with regard to coal ash over the next decade or more. And they have certainly made testimonials to that Public Service Commission that the current plan, again, which leaves 50 million of the 80 million tons capped in place in these unlined pits, is some certain number of $1 billion. And I don't know how many billions of dollars. Well, hundreds and hundreds of millions, if not a few $1 billion. And if they were required to excavate it all, would be an order of magnitude greater. So they've certainly made the allusions to the exponentially higher cost of excavating this waste. And I'm sorry I don't have specific numbers to that. And we do recognize that it probably would be more expensive. We can recognize that. And we also can argue that we don't think it's appropriate for that increased cost to be passed on to the consumers through the Public Service Commission's rate setting. This is a legacy waste that the utility has known about for decades and has been storing in unsafe conditions for decades, at least environmentally unsound conditions for decades, and can and should bear the cost of addressing. So sorry, that's not a full answer, and I'm happy to discuss it more, but it would be more expensive. Senate Bill 123, though, was addressing one end of this, and at least hopefully we think that it sends a message that Georgia isn't the bottom barrel cheapest state that you can start looking to send your toxic coal ash waste to. So we'll see if this slows down the importation. It's maybe more of a message bill than a truly hammer coming down or anything like that. But it is very important because you can see it was a Republican sponsor. It had broad support from legislators, and it's incremental progress on this issue. And again, we just want to see we have enough to deal with in our own boundaries, and we don't really want to see any more coming in. So we had a number of pieces of coal ash legislation move on crossover day. Crossover day at the Georgia legislature is the last day that a bill can pass its original chamber and still have a chance of passage. So if a bill is introduced in the House, it has to pass the House by, I think, day 28 of the legislative session, or it's done for that session. So crossover day is a flurry of activity, and then sine die, the 40th day, is always the next, real massive flurry of activity. So these are just some pieces of legislation that had some traction, some momentum during 2020. And they're really, again, just more incremental bits of public notice, transparency that would see the utility informing the public when they start draining the surface waters from these ponds as they get ready to close them, to do more monitoring of the coal ash ponds, although pretty substantial on-site monitoring is required under the federal and state regulations currently in place. And then I'll talk a little bit more about Senate Bill 384, which is an interesting piece of legislation that was introduced last year, in a moment. The big bill that was introduced in 2020 was House Bill 756. It was all Democratic sponsors, so it never had a real chance of moving, in the current makeup of the Georgia General Assembly. But it required the excavation and removal of coal ash to lined impoundments, and that's kind of still the goal of the Georgia Water Coalition. That's just some of the collateral. The Georgia Water Coalition does kind of, create marketing collateral, use social media, use direct email and phone call action campaigns to reach legislators and try to push these priorities of our own. those are the two major priorities that the Water Coalition is still pursuing. We also have these rollbacks that are just pieces of legislation that crop up every year that we're very successful at raising attention about and actually defeating. It's kind of probably where the most success of the Georgia Water Coalition lies, is kind of drawing on that broad bipartisan base of citizenship, if not, bipartisan unity at the General Assembly. When you talk about property rights and land conservation and protection of resources at a personal level, we usually see that we can get a lot of support among Georgia citizens.
All right, Kevin, we do have another one. Abe is asking, is coal ash being disposed at C and D landfills now?
No, sir, that's not allowed under federal or state regulations. It has to be, there's a couple ways it can be disposed of. One is this process of capping in place on site, which Georgia Power is pursuing. If it's excavated and stored in a private landfill or municipal solid waste landfill, it has to be that a permitted landfill with liners and leachate collection systems. So it has to be a municipal solid waste landfill. It's not being stored at C and D landfills. There's this idea of beneficial reuse of coal ash. That's typically talking about fly ash, which is kind of the airborne or immediate kind of immediate waste stream of burning coal that can be moved around and potentially used in different ways as a beneficial reuse, whether it's in like gypsum material or in some places in road aggregate material. We've heard the bottom ash, this stuff that's being stored in these coal ash pits, is really a sludge at this point. It's a sludge at this point because it's been sitting and being kind of, a lot of these pits were also used as stormwater collection pits. So there's not a lot of beneficial reuse for this material that we know of. So it does need to be disposed of and stored long-term in some way. And if it's going to go to a landfill, it's going to go to a permitted, lined municipal solid waste landfill.
Okay. And we have another one, ESG Engineering. So whoever's there is asking, if Georgia Power does not raise rates to pay for relocation of coal ash to line facilities, where could the money come from?
I mean, they had pretty big profits. I think the CEO of Southern Company made $28 million last year, and the Georgia Power president made somewhere between 8 or 12 million. That's maybe a drop in the bucket, and I'm not saying that there's not some combination, but we do think that their pretty substantial profits could be one source of funding for this, addressing this legacy waste. We don't think that it's necessary or appropriate that every penny falls on the ratepayer. That's kind of the pattern that's been established in Georgia and many other states over the decades, that maybe over the history of semi-public, semi-monopolistic utilities, that they get to pass every expense on while reaping the profits. But we think there's definitely a better balance than what we have now. So I'll talk about, this is House Bill 545 is an interesting piece of legislation, and maybe its relevancy isn't too significant to you all, so I'll move a little more quickly. But this bill essentially, there's a lot of text here, but it sought to rewrite Georgia nuisance law, and it would remove this existing right to farm law that Georgia's had for about 30 years that protects existing agricultural operators from essentially exurban and suburban sprawl. It would remove that and kind of flip the balance of power to new coming agricultural operators. So the way the right to farm law has acted for many decades is that, say you're a regular kind of row crop farmer or a livestock operator, where you have a dairy farm and you've been around for 20 years, and a new subdivision, you're in far rural Coweta County, which is Noonan, and now you have a 300 home subdivision coming in next door. If you've been around for more than a year, say you've been around for 20 years, but you've been around for more than a year, and some residents of that new subdivision move in, they don't get to sue you under Georgia nuisance law for the odors of your operations or some of the other maybe nuisance impacts, because frankly, they came to the nuisance. You were there first. It recognizes the value and vitality of Georgia agricultural operators, and that's what the right to farm bill law has done for many decades. The proposal under House Bill 545 would essentially say, if some new agricultural operator moved into an area after 1 or 2 years, the number fluctuated, but after 1 or 2 years of operations, no one, even that farmer next door who's been there for decades, can sue them for nuisance. And this is a push across the country from the American Farm Bureau and poultry operators and other kind of industrial agricultural livestock operators to weaken nuisance law so that they can expand their really large concentrated animal feeding operations and kind of eliminate a threat of being sued by neighbors for the impacts of these large industrial livestock operations. In North Carolina, there's more than 10 million hogs now, and that's an exponential increase in the amount of hog livestock in that state over the past decade. And there's been a lot of nuisance suits brought by rural property owners and farmers in that state that were there first, and then a hog farmer moved in next door and would use land application of the hog waste from these feces lagoons that they have and spray that waste as land application. And that spray would cross property lines, go on the side of houses, really true nuisance issues, and led to some very large lawsuits and large penalties on these hog farm operators in favor of those neighbors. And so now there's this effort to get out in front of that and pass legislation that would protect these, I'm sorry about the sirens, that would protect these hog farmers, even again from property owners who may have been there for generations. So it's kind of flipping the protections of the right to farm law. So this is some press we got on this across the state of Georgia. A lot of people, hardcore conservative people that are maybe row crop farmers or not subsistence, but family farmers, maybe not large scale commercial farmers, saw that they were losing protections, and it was encouraging maybe this like wide scale livestock operation to come move in next door in a way that might harm them. And we've seen some traditional Georgia farmers who are feeling the impacts of large dairy or other kind of livestock operations. And this is, again, this would not really impact existing operators. Like an existing chicken farm in Northeast Georgia already has this right to farm protection that exists at law. So they're protected already. It's only really kind of to benefit, we think, in our reading of this law, and we've read it very carefully, to protect kind of these new operators that might be coming in and doing potentially nuisance-causing activities. So this is an op-ed by a Georgia farmer who kind of drew in her editorial letter a parallel from the Second Amendment rights and the rights to farm, and how HB 545 upset that right to farm. So I mean, it's a very interesting coalition of people who were concerned about this piece of legislation. I mean, I'll certainly share this presentation with you all so you can see this. The legislation did fail to pass because there was this really broad and passionate base of opposition from kind of South Georgia farmers mostly. They led the charge even in the Capitol, coming to talk directly to legislators. I want to talk about, here's a couple pieces of legislation. These are from 2019, so I haven't really thought about them in almost 2 years. So I apologize if I'm missing some details, but there are some legislation that we worry about or work with throughout our work at the Capitol that specifically deals with professional engineers and some of the work that you may do. There's kind of a trend over the past 4 or 5 years of legislation to change the balance of how local issuing authorities, local governments review and approve erosion, sedimentation, pollution control plans, partially in a valid interest of speeding up the process and gaining efficiencies, but partially because we think they want to weaken some of the oversight that local governments may provide when they're looking at a private party's E&S plan to make sure that it's as protective as possible. These are 2 pieces of legislation from 2019, one that did pass, one that didn't. And House Bill 493 was dealing with the Georgia Soil and Water Conservation Districts and local governments and how they reviewed and approved building permits and erosion and sedimentation control plans for land disturbance permits. The bill really would have allowed essentially farming out or superseding local government's approval of erosion sedimentation plan to kind of a third-party professional engineer as long as they had that PE stamp, and would kind of cut out the LIA and the Soil and Water Conservation District's oversight. There's been conversations about this. This bill wasn't well thought out enough, I think, on that aspect. The bill did eventually pass, but it had removed the language that addressed kind of this superseding of the existing paradigm for approval of erosion and sedimentation control plans. I will share this presentation. There's a hyperlink. You can read that bill. House Bill 422 is more kind of in line with some of the efforts we've seen over the past few years. It was trying to eliminate this memorandum of agreement that is signed between the Georgia and Soil and Water Conservation Commission and most local issuing authorities. In law, the counties have the authority to issue land disturbance permits, but they don't really have the authority to review and approve the erosion, sedimentation, and pollution control plans unless they sign an MOA with the Georgia Soil and Water Conservation Commission. And that MOA is only signed after someone from the Soil and Water Commission looks at the county's operations and staffing and the job they're doing, and basically signs off that they're doing a thorough job of reviewing these plans. That system seems to work, we think. My boss, Jason Olseth, used to work for the Soil and Water Conservation Commission, used to work for EPD, is now an elected Soil and Water District Supervisor, so is deeply involved in all this stuff and kind of has a belief in the value that the soil and water districts provide on this front. But there's an interesting kind of move that maybe many of you listening have taken part of or seen in trying to, again, absolutely recognize the lack of efficiency in many jurisdictions in approving building plans and approving land disturbance permits. But there's some of these legislations are being written in a way that aren't well thought out enough and maybe would allow some bias and kind of conflict of interest in who would be kind of signing off on these plans and superseding the local government oversight. So it's an interesting trend we're seeing. Nothing of impact has really passed, but they do seem to crop up, every year, every other year. So something to look out for. Again, you're welcome to read about those and let me know if you have any questions. A couple other pieces of legislation just related to the environment that cropped up in 2020. This Senate Bill 384 was an interesting attempt to kind of head off a new landfill along the Chattahoochee River. That people in the communities along the Chattahoochee and coastal Georgia were opposed to a new landfill in a fairly environmentally sensitive area with a lot of wetlands near the Chattahoochee River. And in fear that it would also then be a recipient of coal ash, Republican Senator and now retiring Senator William Ligon drafted this piece of legislation that would essentially prohibit the state from permitting solid waste landfills within 3 miles of any Blackwater River in Georgia. Now, it has to be a Blackwater River that's wholly contained in Georgia to avoid some Commerce Clause issues and things of that nature. But this was really addressing kind of some specific fears that then raised broader fears about putting landfills in, and especially in these, hydrologically unique and pristine Blackwater rivers in coastal Georgia. That bill did not pass, although it did pass the Senate and receive a very interesting hearing in the House Natural Resources Committee, but ultimately didn't pass the House. Just a fun piece of trivia: the shoal bass is now the official Georgia riverine sport fish. This is something that was been somehow controversial, had been attempted by Trey Rhodes and Debbie Buckner from Columbus, Georgia area and the Flint River and Chattahoochee watersheds for many years, just to recognize the value of shoal bass and shoal bass fishing to the tourism economy, and particularly along the Flint River, but throughout the state of Georgia. So just a neat thing that happened finally from some of our partners in Georgia. Really a hat tip to Representative Debbie Buckner and the Flint Riverkeeper on that one. There's been a lot of talk about sterigenics and ethylene oxide. Sterigenics is a plant really close to the river in Cobb County, the Chattahoochee River, that sterilizes medical equipment and releases this ethylene oxide into the air. And I guess it started in Chicago and other states, and a realization that this is a pretty potentially harmful air emission that was not well known or well regulated by EPA, and thus there are very few federal or state regulations in place for the limits on air emissions of this of this particular pollutant. So there was some legislation here, again, Republican-led, bipartisan, I think as a result of the substantial outcry from communities around these operations. There's one in Cobb County, I think two in the Newton County area that are releasing pretty high levels of ethylene oxide. So now through Senate Bill 426, they have to at least notify EPD if they release ethylene oxide above a certain level that at least I think is a guidance level from EPA now. House Bill 9, I might have the wrong numbers there. I think it's 857. I apologize. But this was raised over some issues in Northeast Georgia with a business that wanted to go in Northeast Georgia and essentially burn creosote cross ties. They were saying it was for commercial electricity generation, but no one could really track down exactly how that process was working. But there were a lot of fears about air emissions from the creosote. That's been a problem I've seen across Georgia, from pressure treating power line poles to now this burning of cross ties. The release of creosote causes a lot of concerns. So this bill passed to prohibit this business, this broadly prohibit this business, but the practical effect was to thwart this one operator in Northeast Georgia from starting a business that would burn creosote cross ties. That's kind of the general overview of the legislation we saw in 2020, 2019. I'm happy to spend the last 5 minutes answering any more questions. I went a little longer than I meant to, but I hope you saw some value in it, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, let's see, Kevin. I'm looking to see if anybody has anything to add that they haven't already asked. Folks, go ahead and type them in now.
And you see my email address here, or you did. It's
Sure, I'll put it back up.
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk to folks about any of the issues we talked about or anything that the Water Coalition or Riverkeeper does. So please feel free to reach out if you ever have any questions.
I'm not seeing anything at the moment, so we'll give people a few more seconds to see if they have anything else to ask or add. But while we're doing that, I just wanted to take the opportunity to remind everyone this is done through the GSPE YouTube channel. So if you'd like to subscribe and click that notification icon to be notified of future events, the Atlanta Metro chapter, for example, typically does a monthly presentation. And those are available to the public openly from the get-go. So that YouTube channel is youtube.com/GSPENG. So it's YouTube wouldn't let us have just GSPE, so we had to add the November golf at the end there to kind of be the short abbreviation for engineering. All right, so we're getting some thanks coming in. Let's see. Yes, here we have one from Betty Jean. Is there any potential legislation that you know of regarding ES and PC plan review?
Nothing's, we don't know what's coming up in 2021. Legislators may start pre-filing legislation around this time in anticipation of the sessions start in January, but nothing we know of. The big proponent of this was Representative Andy Welch out of, it's kind of in the McDonough area, Stockbridge area. And he's not running he didn't run for re-election. He won't be in the House next year. Funnily enough, he's kind of a thorn in my side on this issue because my boss is so passionate about stolen water and erosion sedimentation. He was also the key element of getting the trust fund honesty House resolution finally over the hump and across the Senate. He was really our champion on that issue in 2020. So, it's very interesting that you may be working in lockstep with the legislator on one issue and then be, butting heads seconds later on another piece of legislation. He was always very easy to work with, but we'll be interested to see if anyone kind of takes up that mantle. There are certainly legislators who are general contractors who, go to Gwinnett County to get building permits and kind of can be buy into this and want to work on this. And again, I don't do that. So I know there's some valid concerns, but we're worried about that kind of third party approval of the erosion sedimentation plans. And we'll keep watching out, but nothing on the horizon that we know of.
Okay. Well, I think that seems to be about it. They've got your contact information, of course. And Kevin, thank you very much for doing this for us today. It's been very enlightening, as Roger put it. So it's good to have this kind of presentation given to the engineering community as well. Helps us out.
My pleasure. My door's always open too for anyone who wants to discuss more.
All right. Thank you very much. And then everybody that's in some of the additional sessions for the rest of the day, the next one will be at 1 p.m. this afternoon. Thank you. And have a great day, Kevin, and go get some lunch, everybody else.